Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. This is episode 90, The Great Plague of Marseille. This week we're going to talk to Professor Cindy Ermus about disaster history as a field and the specific case of the disaster that was the Plague of Marseille, which is also the topic of her upcoming book. Cindy is the co-founder and one of the editors of the Age of Revolutions academic blog, which regularly publishes articles on modern revolutions. It is run with her co-founder and fellow editor, Professor Brian Banks. Cindy can be found on Twitter at Cindy, C-I-N-D-Y, Ermus, E-R-M-U-S, and Professor Banks can be found on Twitter at Brian_A_Banks. The Age of Revolutions blog itself can be found on Twitter as Historioblog, history, but with an I-O at the end instead of a Y, and then blog. And you can also go to the website directly at ageofrevolutions.com. Before we start, we're going to have our monthly book raffle for Patreon donors. If you contribute to the podcast on Patreon, you're entered to win a book through our monthly raffle. This month's winner was Grant Taylor. Congratulations and thanks for contributing, Grant. Your choices for the month are as follows. First, we have a book suggested by Professor Ermus titled Mosquito Empires, Ecology and War in the Greater Caribbean, 1620 to 1914, by John Robert McNeill. Second, in honor of July 14th being the 228th anniversary of the storming of the Bastille. Second, in honor of July 14th being the 228th anniversary of the storming of the Bastille, we're offering The French Revolution, 1787 to 1799, from the storming of the Bastille to Napoleon, by Albert Sobol, whose name I'm no doubt butchering. Third, we have a book that I'm reading right now, and I found pretty interesting, which is The City in History, Its Origins, Its Transformations, and Its Prospects, by Lewis Mumford. The book basically analyzes how cities developed from prehistory through to ancient history in the Middle East, and then also in Greece and Rome, and how cities evolved throughout history, through, of course, the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages, modernity, and up to the early 20th century. I'm about halfway through right now, and it's been an interesting read because it has mostly made me rethink how I approach cities and take into account the fact that the function of a city, and cities in general, changes over time as societies and economies and cultures evolve. So I found it pretty interesting. And at the suggestion of Sun Against Gold, another member of the mod team, and because it also has synergy with today's podcast topic, we're offering Black Death, A Personal History by John Hatcher. Basically, it's a history of the Black Death, the bubonic plague, which affected Europe, especially in the 13th and 14th centuries, but viewed through the lens of everyday people who are just trying to live their lives in the midst of this crisis, this disease that was killing so many people, and which they didn't necessarily fully understand themselves, what the origins were, what was spreading it. And it's both an interesting analysis because it takes you away from the abstraction that some history texts get into, and gives you basically how everyday people saw this crisis. But it also has, of course, synergy with today's podcast because we're dealing with another disaster, and we're getting to see how people and society and local governments responded to that crisis. You can be entered to win a book yourself by going to patreon.com/AskHistorians and supporting the show. Now, without further ado, thanks so much and enjoy the show. Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. My name is Andres Pertiera, and today I'm speaking with Professor Cindy Ermus, also pronounced Ermus in Cuba, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Lethbridge. She teaches courses on early modern Europe and the Age of Revolutions. She's also co-founder, editor, and contributor at the academic blog Age of Revolutions, www.ageofrevolutions.com. And she has a book coming out. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here.
By the way, before we start, what is your upcoming book about?
It's very exciting. So it should be out in December 2017. As publishers go, I suppose there's a possibility it'll come out January of 2018, nevertheless. So this is an edited volume. It's called Environmental Disaster in the Gulf South, 2 Centuries of Catastrophe, Risk, and Resilience. These are these major themes that we visit in the pieces. And so basically we're looking at natural disaster, natural in quotations, natural hazards and disasters, these concepts of risk, and in fact, the concept of disaster itself, what makes for a disaster and the conditions that make for a disaster and whatnot. And we focus on the Gulf South region of the United States because one of the things I ask in the introduction, is this the capital? Is this a capital of disaster, right? By the end of the introduction, I determined that it's not the only capital of disaster. We could say that New York City is in an extremely vulnerable position, as Ted Steinberg and Kevin Gotham and others have recently argued. California, of course, my goodness. If there is a home of disaster, the Pacific Rim is probably it. But the Gulf South is not to be ignored in this particular context because it offers a rich, variety of, it's just a rich history to look back to and apply today in order to make ideally more informed decisions when disaster strikes.
That's actually really interesting. I don't think I've ever heard of disaster as a field or as a real topic. Is this a new field? Is this an old field?
Well, that's a really good question. So I guess relative to, some other, bigger, I suppose, risks fields within this, within the discipline of history, I would say it's relatively newish. Could even be, and it often is considered a subsection, if you will, subdiscipline of environmental history, right? So environmental history, which seeks to answer questions or to look to the relationship between humans and the environment, the way humans have influenced the environment historically, and certainly the way the environment has influenced human events. And that latter, relationship is what disaster history looks at, right? You really can't look at, for instance, parts of World War II or the Napoleonic campaigns without looking at the Russian winters, right? So that's right. One big example, of course. And certainly disaster history is something that I think needs more attention, certainly.
Interesting. And out of curiosity, is there a specific historian or social scientist who inspired you to get into this field?
That's another good question. There are many people, right? I stand on the shoulders, in this case, of giants, because one of the books that influenced me as in the earlier part of my graduate studies was Ted Steinberg, who wrote Acts of God. Right, this book that looks at focuses on the United States, but the questions it asks and the themes that we're looking at in it translate, across society, across cultures, because disaster happens and it can happen anywhere and it affects populations everywhere in the globe every single day. And now that the world is more interconnected than it ever has been, obviously because of technology, we see these things. We're confronted with these things every single day, right? And to ask the question of what makes for a disaster and to explore, as he does and as he did in this text, Acts of God, the role of humans in creating disaster. I just think that's absolutely priceless. And on that note, I shouldn't fail to mention Anthony Oliver Smith, who is now emeritus at University of Florida, if I'm not mistaken. And so an anthropologist whose work also inspired my own at the time, right? Asking these similar questions, the human role in disaster making.
Interesting. And today we're going to be talking with Cindy or Professor Ermus.
Cindy's fine, I insist.
We're going to be talking with her about the
Plague of Marseille, which she insists should be known as the Plague of Provence. What was the Plague of Marseille?
So the Great Plague of Marseille, as it's been traditionally known, it arrives, so to speak, in Marseille through the port of Marseille in 1720, right? And it rages on and off until 1722, through much of 1722. But from Marseille, it spreads out to the rest of the region of Provence, Avignon, Arles, Toulon, right? All over the place. And even into parts of what was at the time the Dauphiné region and Languedoc. So it definitely affected a lot more than just Marseille. And that's why I thought that I should probably, respect that or point to that even and, call it the Plague of Provence. And so this plague, as the story goes, it arrives in Marseille on this ship called the Grand Saint-Antoine that had journeyed for a year in the Levant, right, in the Eastern Mediterranean, picking up cargoes and all these kind of things, cotton bales and all of these things in order to sell them at this annual fair that took place in the south of France annual fair every year. And it was called the Foire de Beaucaire in this small town. And so...
Wait, sorry, what does the fair mean? The fair?
The Foire de Beaucaire, yeah. This was an annual trade fair, if you will, or a commercial fair, I should say. So merchants would have their materials out there, their products out there for sale. And it was just like a big event that took place every year since time immemorial. So going back to, the late medieval era, or something like that.
Okay.
And so the ship arrives in Marseille, and it so happens that one of the lead échevins, one of the lead municipal authorities in Marseille, had a lot at stake in these cargoes. Just had a lot of money that he personally put into it. And so when the ship docks in Marseille, despite the fact that there had been dead bodies on board, there had been several deaths on board in the months before it docked in Marseille, the ship was allowed to enter dock anyway, in part because of the influence of these municipal authorities. They wanted their cargo. He wasn't about to lose any money, right? And so I guess you could say the rest is history, because the ship docks and the infection spreads from there. Now, that's the traditional narrative. And I should mention just very quickly, if I may, that has recently been complicated or enriched, I guess we have yet to find out, by a genetic study. So there are geneticists that are now studying this outbreak, right? And a recent study from as recent as, last year, maybe the year before that at this point, but probably 2017, it argues that the plague bacterium that caused this so the bacteria that causes plague is Yersinia pestis, discovered in 1898 during outbreaks in China by Alexander Yersin. And so this particular strain of Yersinia pestis that caused the 1720 plague, according to these geneticists, actually didn't come in on a ship. They argue that it was already in Europe in these sort of plague reservoirs, right, that just kind of sat around and every now and then emerged to cause these outbreaks. And so that obviously is one of the things I'll be visiting in my book. I'll be exploring in my book. It's like, what these genetic studies can offer the historian, what the historian can offer these geneticists, so on and so forth. But
and this is a different book from the one that's coming out later this year, right?
It is a different book, right? So the edited volume explores disasters, risk, resilience, these important concepts, vulnerability, right, in a series of articles. I wrote the introduction and one of the articles. Ted Steinberg, in fact, who wrote Acts of God, and I mentioned earlier, he's a historian over at Case Western, I believe. He wrote the afterword. But then there are 6 articles, aside from my own, 7 articles altogether. And that one is looking at disaster in the Gulf South in modern times, in the last 200 years. Because I find it important, and I'm fascinated. I think it's important to look at disasters and not limit myself to my area, my century, if you will, of expertise, which is the 18th century, and bring it forward. I think it's important I ask myself the so what question all the time. Like anytime I sit down with a new project or a new idea, I ask myself, so what? Why is this important to humans basically today, right? And so the work that I do in the 18th century, I try to bring it to the present as much as possible. What can we learn from these things? And it was a natural transition to look at the present day in the Gulf South for me, having been raised, in fact, in Miami, Florida, and lived through Hurricane Andrew, which was to this day the scariest night of my life.
I'd imagine.
Yeah, it was scary. So that's the edited volume, and then the monograph, this manuscript that I'm currently writing, which is single author, it's just myself, that is in the works, and that is where I explore the Peste of Provence and disaster and risk and crisis management in the 18th century in particular.
Well, for one, I'm already looking forward to it. It sounds like a very...
Thank you. Thank you. I'm excited. I love the work. In a twisted kind of way, I suppose. It's not exactly a happy topic, but so it goes.
What was it? Who was it that said that the happy times of history are the less interesting?
Ain't that the truth, I guess, huh? Jeez, just like us humans to focus on the negatives. Oh, gosh.
One thing that you mentioned was the plague reservoir. So the plague was already present. This is the bubonic plague, right?
Yes. Well, bubonic, but so there were... It's the most common manifestation of plague is the bubonic form, right? Where these actual buboes, as they were occasionally called, these big bulbs that would grow in your major, basically for example, in your armpit and your groin area, waxing at times to the size of, an apple or something like that, or an egg. So that's the bubonic form, came with the fever and the headaches and everything else. And of course, the acral necrosis, which is where your extremities, for instance, your fingers basically die, turn black, right? And that's what gave the Black Death the name back in the middle of the 14th century, the second pandemic. But there were also pneumonic forms of the plague. Even in 1720, I've been able to I've come across some documents from the 1720 outbreak that seem to indicate there were pneumonic forms, which is the pulmonary version that plague can take, right? And that's where it's more of a lung infection. And so there's more, bloody sputum and that kind of thing. And that was also could be very fatal, certainly. Yeah.
Both sound equally horrifying.
Yes, and that's not even the worst one. The most rare form is the septicemic form that bubonic plague can take. Pardon me, that plague can take, and that is the blood infection. And I mean, need I say more, right? Blood infection, your heart pumps that blood through your body very quickly. It doesn't take long to kill you. All right, so yeah. It's the most rare form. Yeah.
Right. By the time that the Plague of Provence is happening in the early 18th century, the bubonic form has kind of died out or passed, or that's not, at least not the problem. We're dealing with the lung version of the plague.
No. In 1720, the bubonic form is still the dominant, the most commonly seen. Yeah, the most commonly seen in that outbreak. But after 1720, these outbreaks of plague in Western Europe become extremely rare. There were outbreaks in 1743 in Messina and in Ceuta. But after that, that's it. These are the final, whips, if you will, los últimos suspiros of plague in Western Europe in the 18th century. And of course, it goes on in many other parts of the world. And for that matter, for those of you in Arizona or the deserts of Western United States, there's plague out there. Next time you go hiking in the desert, bring your sturdy boots, There is. Yeah.
Bubonic plague.
Bubonic plague lives in the deserts of Western United States, in certain in these small animal populations. And every now and then you see in the news that some person, right, some child or some person contracted bubonic plague in the 21st century. And thankfully, of course, because of the miracle of modern medicine, they survived. They typically survive, but still pretty bad. Not fun.
That sounds like they imported over something or brought over some lice and it popped over the local population, right?
It's I haven't familiarized myself with the literature on the what is the origin of the particular strain that lives out in the desert, but I have the impression that it's been there just a long time, right? I wonder.
Wow.
I wonder, yeah. Creepy.
Well, now I have less reason to wander the desert.
Even less, right?
Let's talk a moment about the connecting your study of how crises are handled and the specific case of the Plague of Provence. It sounds like they had preventative measures in place. They knew they weren't supposed to bring people into the port, but they did. Why? With the preventative measures in this case were just overruled due to greed, was what you were saying, right?
Initially. A large treasury, indeed, of these documents that kind of... So there's definitely a variety of different individuals who agree on this particular part of the story, if you will. The part, where these local municipal authorities, what they wanted did override what was typical practice, for public health, to preventative measures and whatnot were overridden because as these contemporary eyewitnesses basically told the story, it was greed, right? They wanted their cargo. And so that's how the ship gets in the first place and whatnot. But there were absolutely preventative measures in place, typically that would have otherwise maybe prevented it, right? Because the ship would have stayed out on the island of Pomègue off the coast of Marseille rather than docking into... Or I'm sorry, I said Pomègue, but it might have been an island farther out first before coming into Pomègue. I forget, I'm sorry. But that might have prevented the plague from coming in. We don't know. Would it have come in anyway, given the interconnectedness of the 18th century world, right? I wonder.
Yeah. And so now the plague is here, is in the city. That denying ships entry to the port was the first line of defense. What was was there a second line of defense against an outbreak?
Oh gosh, there were many. And yeah, absolutely. And that's an important question too, because a lot of so basically the 1720 plague remains in France. And, it actually is successfully contained to southern France, to the region of Provence for the most part. And it doesn't ever spread to the rest of Europe or even the rest of France for that matter. And so for decades and well into the 19th century, into the 1800s, the preventative measures put in place in 1720 by not only local authorities and not only French authorities in Paris at the time, but also all over Europe, because everybody kind of mobilizes at this time. These centralizing states, right? These emerging nation states in the early 1700s are all coming in and responding to keep this thing from crossing into their own borders. And it was deemed such a success that into the 19th century, this particular outbreak is coming up, in plague manuals and manuals about commerce and quarantine and all these kind of things. It's seen as a huge success. It's referenced for its successes, right? Even during the late 18th century outbreaks of yellow fever in Philadelphia, people are referencing the Marseille plague, and looking at it as a great success. And so you're absolutely right that one of the biggest, the first measures in place is, well, once we finally admit that there's plague in Marseille, no more ships are coming in, right? Because there were months worth of denial on the ground in Marseille that it was plague. Some of these local municipal authorities hired doctors, in fact, to say that it wasn't plague because they didn't want to be, right? They didn't want to be blocked off commercially. Marseille was one of the most important port cities in the 18th century world at this time. It had a sort of commercial monopoly for trade with the Levant, with the Eastern Mediterranean. And so blocking it off from that could, economically catastrophic. And for a time it was, but I should mention the happy ending is that Marseille recovered remarkably quickly from all of this within some years after the plague clears up in 1722. So no ships can enter or come out of Marseille, but also on land. There were there were quarantines put in place town after town to where people couldn't move freely, right? Like in the very beginning, those who could afford to left Marseille. And then once these, quarantine lines were put in place, there was no movement in and out of the city for the most part, right? That was the idea. There were also military lines put in place to enforce all this, where literally lines of armed soldiers would, prevent people from crossing certain borders and things like that. The Mur de la Peste, the plague wall that went up in the countrysides of Provence, you can still see parts of these walls if you go there today. The ruins of the wall are still there, which is really interesting.
Wait, you mean a literal...
A literal stone wall, right. Yeah. Which is interesting to look at given, we're in an age of walls today, it seems. Well, there were walls then too, that's for sure. And this one was to prevent, the movement of peoples who might be infected with plague, right? And, yeah.
But this must have been a massive wall because, if you're just building a wall around a town, that's a huge undertaking. But if you're doing a quarantine outside of the city limits, that increases the radius.
Right. It does. And there were different installments of it too, as I understand it. Yeah. And what's left of it today, it's not much, but it's still interesting to note. Yeah. It's quite an endeavor.
The crown just doled out thousands and thousands of coins to...
Livres, yeah.
Livres, yeah. That's a very serious undertaking, but also... that's not a poor or weak state that's doing this. This is a pretty, serious state that it can actually mobilize that kind of resources and manpower.
Absolutely. And, that's one of the main actual fundamental arguments in my monograph is that that's exactly what we're seeing here. We're seeing a sort of centralization of power at this time that is manifesting itself or that is displaying itself in the management of this particular crisis, right? Because typically prior to the 18th century, you look at different outbreaks that took place very regularly, right? Beginning in the middle of the 14th century with the Black Death, the one that everybody's heard about, that big outbreak, right? Medieval outbreak. These smaller outbreaks, smaller in quotations, I guess, they can be pretty catastrophic. These other outbreaks would take place across the European continent very regularly. And it starts to slow down in the later 1600s. And by the time you get to the 18th century, like I said, it really tapers off. But typically you look at these other outbreaks in the early modern period, and what you see is that they're handled locally for the most part. Right? Municipal authorities step in and put certain measures in place to keep the plague, to keep the outbreak of disease, whatever it may be, under control as much as possible, to keep families in some towns, quarantined in their homes, to keep it from spreading, to do these public smokings and fires and things, and the firing of cannon, which was believed to break up the bad air, the miasmas that could cause plague, because loud sounds were believed to eliminate bad air that causes plague, and things like that. And what we see in the 18th century, in particular, with the 1720 Plague of Provence, this huge mobilization of resources takes place, coming mostly from the capitals of these emerging nation states. So we see the centralization of crisis management take place in a very real way at this time, and that's what makes this particular outbreak so unique and important, I think. Right? So looking at the diplomacy of the early 18th century, which is surprisingly understudied to begin with, if you look at the diplomacy, the studies that have been out there, they don't take into account what's going on in the sense of, any kind of environmental events taking place, disasters taking place, crises taking place, disease outbreaks and things like that. And I think it's really important not to ignore that because, imagine if there was an outbreak of some kind of, God forbid, disease today. Obviously, that's going to have a major impact on what's going on politically, diplomatically, decisions being made on different levels in, across countries, if it's significant enough, right? So to look at what's going on politically in the 1720s and to not look at, and ignore this particular outbreak, I think it's just missing a huge piece of what's going on, right? And there was a lot going on politically, of course, right?
Interesting. And so, out of curiosity, this is a bit more of a specific question, but within the city, while it's dealing with all this plague, was there any sort of obviously you mentioned cannon fire to try and release the humors,
the miasmas, right.
One thing that Alejandro de la Fuente mentions in his book on the 16th century Havana is that in order to deal with I think it wasn't an actual plague, it was like some sort of issue with the crops. I think it was ants. There was a plague of ants eating up all the sugar cane. And so they had a series of religious festivals, and they killed a bull, and they did all these other kind of magical rituals, religious. Was there kind of any sort of, religious reaction to the plague in Marseille?
Absolutely, there was. There were many. Well, what comes to mind is the Bishop Belsons puts together, organizes, mobilizes the religious aspect of all of this, and kind of, basically the way that people typically explained plague throughout the early modern period. And this too begins to change in the 18th century, but is it divine punishment, right? This is a punishment from God because of whatever, because of usury, which is lending on interest, or because of prostitutes, or because of gambling, all of these things that can anger God enough to unleash a plague upon a population of unsuspecting, victims or people. And so Belsons, the bishop at this time in Marseille, organizes these huge religious marches and everything that eventually takes the form, calls it the Sacred Heart, the cult of the Sacred Heart, right? As in the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And the idea was that there would be these huge parades, religious parades through the streets, taverns, and of course, brothels and everything else are shut, right? Completely. People had to participate. They were expected to participate in these religious events, public prayers, right? Basically putting candles in your windows, for instance, to, at the same time and things like that on certain evenings to show that you're participating, things like this. This was all part of what he called the cult of or what has been called the cult of the Sacred Heart, which was a direct response to the Plague of Provence, under the assumption that it was caused by God's wrath. It's like, well, now we need to appease God, of course. How do we do that? Let's put all of these events together. Let's all pray together, come together in crowds, which is not the best thing to do in plague times, right? In times of infection, we now know, and try to appease the Lord, right? And so that's one big manifestation of, this religious side, or the religious response, I should say.
And that brings me to another question. You mentioned early on that the source of the plague was discovered in the late 19th century, but did these people really understand what was happening? Because I understand in the 18th century that you get the beginnings of, for example, vaccinations against forms of smallpox and other kinds of things, but did they understand that this was just a virus like any other? Did they understand what a virus was?
No, there was really no understanding of that on any, anything on any level close to what we know today, right? There was no concept of germ theory, right? So there was basically what you have, there was no concept of illness there was little concept, I should say, this as you pointed out as well, this begins to change in the 18th century. There was little concept of illness as external. We now know that illness external caused by bacteria, for example, or viruses, and things like that but in the early modern period and even before, Galenic medicine or Hippocratic medicine basically was the foundation of medicine for century after century until so very recently. And it basically said that illness was internal, right? Illness was caused by the imbalance of humors which were, every human body was made up of 4 humors, which is 4 fluids, right? So not humors in the funny sense, humors in the fluid sense. And it was blood, black bile, phlegm, right? And yellow bile as and basically an imbalance of these, anything that threw off your personal balance of all of these, caused dyscrasia, which is the imbalance of these, and it could cause illness, it could cause erratic behavior, depression, hysteria in women, so on and so forth. And so that is, if you look at medical, in quotations, understandings at this time, it's going to be looking at humoral medicine, basically. These humoral understandings of what causes disease, which is completely, there's no concept of germs or bacteria or viruses or anything like that in there. People were more likely to believe the disease was caused by, aside from divine wrath, by a comet, for example, if there was, or, the eruption of a volcano, anything that basically was seen as an omen, that could be perceived as an omen, even astrology, right? The position of the stars could cause disease, right? If your local astrologist says, "Oh, beware, because Scorpio will be crossing whatever," you'd be like, "Oh my gosh, I better go out to the country this season because there might be plague." Things like that.
Damn flu! Why does Jupiter have to?
Darn it! Exactly. People were more likely to believe that than to have any concept of, like I said, of these external causes to disease. And so, but I should mention that in the 18th century, you start to see there's a sort of movement towards these more modern understandings of medicine, a move away from humoral medicine. Now it's very, very slow. Very much the case that in the late 1800s and late 19th century, people still believed in concepts of humoral medicine. It's been extraordinarily persistent in a lot of cultures to this day, actually. And so, but nevertheless, you start to see a move away from that. In 1720 in England, there was, the outbreak in Provence unleashes this huge debate, in particular, in London in particular, interestingly, between the anti-contagionists and contagionists. On the other hand, these people who believed that quarantine was useless, on the one hand, because they were miasmatists, meaning that they believed in this concept of miasmas, these bad vapors that cause disease, right, that were absorbed in your pores or through your lungs when you breathe. On the one hand, and they're like, well, quarantine is useless because if this is what causes disease, what's quarantine going to do? It's in the air. What can you do, right? And on the other hand, you have those who believed quarantine is absolutely useful. We've seen since time immemorial that commerce plays a role in the spreading of disease. The movement of peoples and commodities can cause disease because obviously they're spreading into new populations, so on and so forth. The fact that debate was even happening, I think, is important to know, right? Is interesting in terms of these understandings, right?
And these miasmas, they weren't just, this isn't that the miasmas were the same thing as the people who are just saying it's a curse from God. This was a different hypothesis.
Well, one could argue, it could be seen that way, certainly, but one could also argue that it was God who was causing the conditions that caused the bad air.
Right. So there may be partial overlap.
Yes, certainly. There could absolutely be overlap. Yes, definitely. Okay. Because, maybe it was God who made the comet, appear in the sky as a sign, like, this is going to throw off the vapors. There's plague coming because of your sins. There could absolutely, I mean, that's a hypothetical, of course, but an example, of course, but there could absolutely be overlap, yeah.
And how much of how is the population level of Marseille affected by this plague?
Yeah, that's a good question. The numbers in the actual contemporary record, I've done research. So my research for this book has taken me across Europe because I shouldn't fail to mention that what I'm looking at is not necessarily what happened in France. I look at that too as well. I looked at that too, of course, but what I'm looking at is despite the fact that the plague never left France, why is it mentioned ubiquitously, like in records across Europe, in the historical archives of Europe? People in Spain talked about it for all those years, right? Even after the plague ended, it's still a dominant topic in contemporary collections in Spain and in England and in parts of Italy and Lisbon, everywhere. And so what I've done is I've traced these communications about what's going on in France across Europe, and it's taken me to places all over. And so we see. Well, actually, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. What was the original question?
what was the impact on the population?
Right. And so what you see is that because you're looking at documents all over, and this is the case for anything really in history, the numbers don't agree, right? So there was one contemporary register that lists the number of deaths that took place between 1720 and 1722 in all of Provence, and this particular person came up with a number of about 76,000 deaths, right? But how do we know, right? So what I've done is I've basically taken all of these things into consideration, including the work of previous historians, of course, Biraben and Panzac, for example, Carrière. Look at all these numbers, compare them to the actual historical record, and come up with the best estimate possible. And one of the, and this is ongoing in many ways. I'll be back in Europe for research here in a few weeks, in fact. But what I've found is that about half the population of Marseille perished at this time. And maybe, and that may actually include some of the people who left early on, right? Who actually survived but just left Marseille. But nevertheless, I would say about 40,000 people died in the city of Marseille over these years. And in all of Provence and all of the affected towns, by the end of 1722, by the end of the outbreak, as many as, 120,000 people might have perished.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
120, 126, yeah, something like that.
Especially for the 18th century, that's an enormous number of people. I think
Philadelphia
right now is about like 10 to 15,000 people around the time we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So this is like the fact that didn't wipe out the entirety of Marseille says that Marseille was a pretty large town, and even so,
it was
a huge portion of its population.
Absolutely, it really is. And again, that's why it's important to be cautious with these things and to take into account the fact that it could include the people who left early on, so on and so forth. But yeah, I'm in the process, in fact, of coming up with the most exact number possible, which is, take that with a grain of salt. And it's also over the period of 2 years. To give you an example, one of the most monumental disasters in history, certainly in Western history, was the 1755 Lisbon earthquake. Mm-hmm. And that one took about 40,000 Lisbonese, Lisboans, if you will, over a couple of days, right? It took the same number, 40,000 in Marseille over a couple of years versus 40,000 in Lisbon over a couple of days because of the Lisbon earthquake on November 1st, 1755. So nature is a force to be reckoned with, certainly.
Yeah. But the Lisbon earthquake also had the misfortune of being on like some special festival or holiday, right?
It was All Saints Day. Yeah, it was a very important Catholic holiday. Yeah.
Yeah, and supposedly that also spurred a lot of the not atheism, but a lot of secularists.
It did, right? Because it inspired none other than Voltaire to write his works. Arguing against Leibnizian thought, for example, in Candide, or his poem Sur le désastre de Lisbonne, right? His poem on the disaster in Lisbon, where he questions all of these things, and he just kind of, he's moved to his core, we could say, yeah.
Which is yet another impact of disasters.
Absolutely.
Disasters impacting intellectual development as well as scientific or state development.
Absolutely. It's important to look at these things, right? Because up to this point, it's not something that has, as you pointed out yourself, one of the earlier questions today was, Is this a relatively new field? In many ways, it still is, in fact. And should it be? Isn't this something we should have been looking at for a long time? I mean, certainly disasters haven't been completely ignored in the historiography. That's not the case. People have looked at, obviously, the Black Death and the military disasters and the Chicago Fire and so on and so forth. But I think that a lot more attention should be paid to this as when you look back into the past. Certain things shouldn't be ignored. Can you look at the causes of the French Revolution, for example, one of the most controversial and important topics, I would argue, in the historiography, without looking at the famine, right? And the bad harvest and the bad winter that took place in 1788, for example, right? So it's important to take these things into account, I think. Yeah.
And that actually brings me to a kind of more abstract question, which is, what distinguishes the theory or methodology of disaster or crisis studies from more traditional methodologies of, political history or social history?
You can definitely say that there is social history and disaster history. I mean, certainly you can approach disaster history in a variety of different ways, but it's difficult to eliminate the social aspects, right? Because you are looking at, for example, you're typically looking at least in part, at the impact of these natural hazards or these natural events on a population of humans, of course, right? And so that's what makes it a disaster, right? Because if there's a hurricane at sea, category 5, it's not a disaster until it actually affects a population of humans, right? And it actually, So there's political history in disaster studies as I approach it too, because I'm looking at the influence in this particular study. One of the things I look at is crisis management and the impact of this particular crisis on diplomacy in the early 18th century. Diplomacy across Europe in this time of, just literally plague arrives in France weeks after the signing of the Treaty of The Hague that ends the War of the Quadruple Alliance. That was in part an attempt by Spain to get back what it had lost in the War of the Spanish Succession that ended earlier with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. Questions of Gibraltar, of course, come up at this time. And I look at all these things. That's all very political. And I'm looking at it, in fact, through the lens of this crisis, of this plague outbreak. So there is social history and political history and economic history, for that matter, and certainly cultural history and all of this in disaster studies. And it really comes down to how you approach it. There's obviously environmental history as well in it. So that's another, I think, big positive of disaster history. That's why I'm a huge proponent of looking at these things, in part, is because it's so rich. There's so many ways to approach it. There's so many questions to be asked. There's so much that it can teach us that we can actually use today, right? Because it's not like disasters are going anywhere. As more and more humans move to more corners of the earth, we're just going to be confronted with these things more and more often, especially given the fact of climate change, of course, right? Rising seas, global warming, everything that we absolutely know is happening. So,
yeah, interesting. And it's still young as a field, but it definitely seems that means that there's still a lot of opportunities to really delve with this new methodology.
Absolutely. There really is. And it's an ongoing learning process for those of us who do it as well, right? For instance, I'm teaching disaster history course in the fall for the first time, crisis and catastrophe, right? And that, I'm looking at that not only as, something I'll be offering my students, but as an opportunity to learn myself. I think that I'm going to come away from that course that much richer, with that much more perspective in my own field than before I started it, because it's going to allow us to, in a group, right, go through a variety of primary sources, contemporary sources, of course, right? And secondary sources too, for that matter, and discuss them and hash them out and tear them up and problematize them and all of this kind of stuff. So it's an ongoing process for me too. My own approaches to this field, my own feelings on it, and the development of my own methods, right? My own methods in what I do as a historian, right? in this particular discipline, in this particular field. I mean, yeah.
In your mind, what are kind of the major obstacles or challenges to a disaster history right now?
Right now, gosh, I mean, it really comes down to the sources, right? I think that there's more opportunity in disaster history than there are challenges. There's always going to be challenges for any researcher of any discipline. Certainly in history, our challenge is trying to make sense of the past as much as we can, given our limited resources. Our limited resources being whatever we can find in the archives, right? Because that's our lab. We don't have labs with white coats and lab assistants and whatnot. We have, our lab is the archive in many ways, right? Or the sources that we look to, whatever they may be, whether they're archival or not, to try to put together the past. And so that's always going to be something, a battle, right? Giving voices to the past with limited resources. But there's also a lot of opportunity more than anything, because disaster history is also, I think, represents a huge opportunity for interdisciplinary work, right? Because, for instance, there's a disaster center that I just recently learned about, a couple hours north of where I teach at the University of I teach at the University of Lethbridge, but up in Mount Royal University, there's a disaster research center. I mean, these things are all over. There's one here at FIU, I believe, too, in Miami, Florida. So on and so forth, but they tend to be interdisciplinary, right? So they have geographers and anthropologists and ideally historians. I hope they've caught on to the importance, to the value of having historians on board already, and of course geologists and so on and so forth working on this, because again, disasters, right? What aspect of life does this not touch on? What aspect, and there's so many ways of approaching it that it's an opportunity for interdisciplinary work as well, I think. More so than the challenges, I see opportunities, to answer your question in a really long way. Pardon me.
That's important, I think. So hopefully, maybe there's a future disaster historian in the making just listening to this podcast.
Oh gosh, I hope so.
They decide to join the field.
Absolutely, and if there is, do shoot me an email if you have any questions. I just love talking to people about the work that we do and prospective historians and whatnot. Yeah.
I can personally attest that you're very, very, very warm, even if someone's shooting you an email or a message completely out of the blue.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no worries at all. I welcome it, like I said.
Perfect. I think that should about do it for today. Do you have anything you'd like to add, or any final message or to listeners?
No, gosh, nothing off the top of my head. I just want to thank you for the opportunity. It's been fun. I would love to hear from any listeners, if there's any questions, or anything like that, any comments or anything. Yeah, that's it.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on with us and talking about this really interesting and really not that well-known aspect of history, at least the general public. Even to me, I mean, I have a degree in history, and I certainly had no idea this was even a thing. And I encourage our listeners to go to the blog, the academic blog, which she edits and writes articles for.
Yes, please do. Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't actually end up talking about the whole revolution. The concept of revolution is crisis, which maybe we'll get to that one some other time, but that might, be my next project, in fact. So yeah.
I look forward to it. The blog is agerevolutions.com. She has her upcoming book, which is titled
in December 2017 with LSU Press. It's Environmental Disaster in the Gulf South, 2 Centuries of Catastrophe, Risk, and Resilience.
Perfect. So Cindy, thanks again for coming on with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again to Professor Cindy Ermus for taking the time to talk to us today and about the exciting new field of disaster history and her work on the Plague of Marseille. As we heard today, studying disasters can be a very useful way of getting insight into societies, cultures, and governments by seeing how they react when pushed to their limits. We see the changing role of the state from an entity which traded protection from foreign invaders and local thugs in exchange for a part of the local population's economic surplus, to now proactively attempting to limit the spread of disease and in the process mobilizing massive resources. We see what people turn to in their darkest hour of despair and fear. And we see how social bonds bend and twist under the pressure of extreme hardships. In short, just as a crisis can reveal hidden aspects of individuals, it can also be used to understand the hidden depths of societies as well. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Ask Historians podcast. The podcast aims to bring together people who are passionate about history in order to expand our understanding of the past and, through the past, our present. Next episode, 400 Rabbits, will be back. We hope to see you then.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.